I'd like to sidestep here out of the ordained. We've already talked about the laity. Let's talk about the last group of people in the Catholic Church, religious orders. So Lumen Gentium makes this point very strongly about the religious, like our supreme practitioners of the evangelical counsels, poverty, chastity, and obedience. And then it specifies how like these are like shortcuts to holiness, and they are like supremely powerful. There was one part, actually, I had to chuckle to myself. Lumen Gentium cites these two documents, the Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and the Lausaic History of Palladius. Each are it's like a combined over 500 pages long. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what was cited in these? I don't want to read both of these things and figure. And then I realized, like, I think it's just that they exist, these two books, because you read through and it's like chapter 1 is like the Carthusian, or not the Carthusian, but it's like chapter 1 is like this group of people, chapter 2 this group of people, chapter 4 this group of people, and it's just like each of these different groups of religious orders and how they're like phenomenally holy and how they're exemplars of, you know, holy life. So I took that to mean that like the evangelical counsels are so fantastic. They are like truly, you know, they are the infinity stones on the power gauntlet that every Catholic needs to have. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the religious?
I like that you noted that it's something every Catholic needs to have. The monks and the religious, nuns as well, of course, right? So the religious, their course, as you said, to practice chastity, poverty, and obedience. They take vows towards those ends. Now, the key here is that Vatican II was saying that the religious, they're the ideal for how we ourselves should be behaving as laity. So I find an interesting shift in tone here with Vatican II, where prior to Vatican II, it does seem that the emphasis is on religious life and it's on them becoming saints, but very little emphasis on the laity becoming saints. I think what Vatican II is doing is it's showing that those who are in the religious life are examples of how we ourselves should live. So I really appreciate that you mentioned the laity there at the end.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So I've been in dialogue with Austin Suggs from Gospel Simplicity. Okay, so now he isn't here to defend himself, so maybe this isn't fair. Fine. He like rather famously recognizes the importance of a religious life, like a consecrated religious life dedicated to God. Yeah. And he acknowledges that there is significant benefit and that Protestantism lacks that.
Yeah.
However, when I pressed him about it, you know, like a year from now, when he's Pastor Austin, he's not going to recommend it to his congregants. What would you comment about that?
That's unfortunate. This has been a tradition that we've had going back to the early days of the first millennium. And where it really came from is prior to Christianity being legalized, many Christians were being persecuted for being Christians, right? It wasn't popular to be a Christian. In fact, a lot of the people who attended the first Council of Nicaea, when, right after Christianity had been legalized by Constantine, some of the fathers there were maimed and they had missing eyes and missing limbs and things like that because they had been tortured previously under other emperors. So during that period of time, there were a lot of martyrs, a lot of people who were dying for their faith. Whenever Christianity was legalized, that was relaxed and it was more acceptable socially to be a Christian. So there was a loss of fervor there. So what a lot of people did is they began to suffer what we would call white martyrdom. Instead of actually being martyred and having their blood shed, they would go into the desert, especially the desert of Egypt, and pray, and they would fast, and they would engage in these rigorous practices where they're mortifying their flesh because they're no longer being persecuted. This is how they would mortify their flesh. And so that's really where the tradition of monasticism and religious life developed out of. So this is part of our tradition that is very, very old, and to see that it's not present in some Christian communities is definitely concerning, and I do think that there is a loss there, because again, they are to imitate how we as laity are to live, right? They do so better. They do so in a way that is more heroic, and they're better disposed to it because they don't have a wife or a husband and kids and a job and things like that. They're able to engage in heroic acts of faith, but they're still to serve as a model for us. And if you're in a Christian community where you lack that, where you don't have that, I don't know if people are going to be as inspired to grow in holiness if they don't have the religious in their community as good examples and witnesses for them.
I didn't know that. I had heard the term white martyrdom before. I didn't know that white martyrdom had those roots
Mhm.
and also was like the formation then of what we would call monastic life today.
That was the formation, yeah, from the desert of Egypt, especially. And in fact, one of the earliest ones was Father Anthony of the desert. Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a biography about him. And so Protestants who would be right there affirming Athanasius, they would say, yeah, 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 Athanasius, he was the defender of the Trinity. Athanasius writes a biography about Anthony of the Desert. And it's all about his monastic way of life. In fact, monasticism really comes from him. He's the father of monasticism. So really monks are they're imitating him. Um, yeah, so it's interesting though that Protestants will affirm Athanasius, his Trinitarian views, but they might not be aware of how Athanasius promoted the religious life by writing about Saint Anthony, which that work inspired many people to become monks too. So
Couldn't a cynic look at this white martyrdom though and say like, hey, uh, like people were legit being martyred and tortured for their faith. And like you're just doing that to yourself, man. That's not necessary. This is all you're just imposing pain on yourself that is not gainful. And like it's one thing to suffer for Christ. It's another thing to
mm-hmm.
like impose your own suffering for Christ, okay? Which in a sense could, devaluate the entire basis of monastic life then.
Mm-hmm.
If
Well, there's a right way to mortify the flesh and a wrong way. And now,
oh,
of
okay,
course, the
yeah.
concept comes from Scripture. Paul talks about mortifying the flesh,
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus talks about fasting and almsgiving and things like that. So the concepts are biblical, but there is a way in which some abused it. Some
Okay.
abused their flesh. They fasted so much to the point that it did damage to their health. I don't think that everybody who is in the religious life would agree that that's the best way to practice that virtue, the virtue of fasting.
Sort of
I do.
the
I,
Dan Brown version of like Opus Dei, with the monk who's
right.
like whipping himself constantly.
Right. And of course, St. Peter Damian wrote about some of the benefits for self-flagellation and things like that. There might be a proper place and time for that in rare cases for certain monks. But of course, they would need to be guided by a spiritual director, and the vast majority of laity shouldn't be engaging in that most likely. But I digress. There's a good way to mortify the flesh, and there's an abuse of it. And there are fathers who have written about this, and they will note that some people went too far, and some of them abused these things. But just because there's abuse, that doesn't negate proper use. So somebody who's a cynic that says, "Oh, well, you're just harming your flesh" or something like that. I'm not sure that that's actually what the religious life is supposed to offer. I'm not sure that that's actually what they're doing. I mean, is that what Jesus did when he fasted for 40 days? Was he harming his body? Not necessarily, no.
I mean, I feel like the response would be that 40-day fast is a lot. And that's going to have at least some temporary toll on your body.
Mm-hmm.
You would recover. Yeah, it wouldn't kill
Sure.
you, especially if you're
Sure.
prepared for it. But I mean, 40 days seems like a lot.
It does, but I think that as long as permanent damage isn't being done, I'm not
Okay.
sure that there's an issue here. I think that Chrysostom might be a good example here. In some of his early days, he fasted to the point that he had major problems with his digestive system, if I recall correctly. He had major
Hmm.
physical problems that came from it. Um, One could argue that, okay, maybe that's going a little too far, right? Maybe that does need to be balanced out. Um, Maybe one should imitate the way Christ did it, because I don't think that Christ damaged any of his organs. For example, I don't think that he damaged his flesh when he fasted for 40 days. I'm sure he balanced it out.